I'm delighted that you're here. I'm going to begin with a question, and I do this with all my classes too. In the case of my classes, well, I wouldn't necessarily make them answer this question. I don't want to see a show of hands, but I do want you to think about what your answer would be. How many of you think that the United States should be the world's policeman, the top cop on the planet Earth? Okay? So, okay, I'm not asking you to show hands. I just want you to think about that question. What if I rephrase it slightly? How many of you think that the United States should be the leader of the free world? Okay? Let me just ask, nod if you find that formulation of it more appealing than the first one. Okay, so I'm going to give you a really brief history of American thinking on that very subject. And I'm going to tell you that from the 1790s, when George Washington, upon retiring from the presidency, said, don't get involved in the affairs of Europe, which were the only affairs that mattered to the new American nation. And he said, don't get involved in the affairs of Europe. And he was succeeded, one president removed, by Thomas Jefferson, who said, eschew entangling alliances. And Americans took that to heart. And they thanked themselves and their ancestors who had the good sense to leave Europe behind, cross a wide ocean that separated them physically, politically, and in terms of their expectations for their country from Europe. Europe was that place that was always embroiled in politics, embroiled in wars. Those wars would reach out and grab the United States and enmesh the United States unless Americans took pains to avoid them. And Americans, from the 1790s until the 1930s, kept George Washington's counsel in mind. They very often repeated themselves, that the father of our country had said, stay out of the affairs of Europe. There was almost no dissent to this. Almost nobody said, Europe's troubles should be America's troubles. America should make Europe's troubles its own. There was an important exception to this, but it was one of those exceptions that proved the rule. And that was during World War I. And I should say that I'll remind you from your study of history, not from your personal experience by any means, that World War I was not always called World War I. In fact, is there anybody in the room who can remember when World War I was just called the World War or the Great War? You have to be fairly old. You have to, of course, remember a time before World War II. And when you start numbering disasters, you know you got problems. But World War I was not called World War I until there was a World War II. And in the United States decided to set aside George Washington's counsel in 1917 and enter an ongoing war in Europe that seemed to be stuck between Britain and France on one side and Germany and its allies on the other side. And it occurred to the President of the United States that this was an opportunity for America to step in, for the new world to step in and repair the problems of the old world, to show the old world how to get things right. The president was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was an academic. He had been a professor of history and political science. He also, he was the father of a Presbyterian minister, and he often thought of himself as having a calling. In fact, there was a moment not long after Wilson was elected when his campaign manager came up to him and reminded the president-elect, as he put it, there are a great many loyal Democrats who worked to get you elected, who worked to make you president. And they will expect jobs in the administration and so on. And Wilson looked at him and said, God made me president of the United States, and I don't owe anything to anyone else. Anyway, Wilson decided that American interests and the welfare of the world required that the United States go to the rescue of Europe, where the warring parties, where the belligerents were killing each other by this time by the millions. World civilization could not survive a war like this that lasted much longer. So Wilson led the United States into World War I. He said that Europe's problems are America's problems, or at least the United States should make Europe's problems its own. And it does so for the benefit of the Europeans, for the benefit of the United States, for the benefit of the world. The purpose in going to war in 1917 in Europe was, said Wilson, to make the world safe for democracy. And Americans allowed themselves to be talked into it. They had been skeptical at the beginning of the war in 1914. The war had been going on for 2.5 years before the United States got involved. But Americans went in. 200,000 Americans died in the war. It was a bloodbath unmatched in American history, with the sole exception of the Civil War. That lasted longer, and it was Americans against Americans. So 200,000 Americans died in 18 months during the period when the United States was at war. Many Americans hoped that that sacrifice would at least lead to a permanent peace, because President Wilson had an idea for reorganizing world affairs and bringing all the great countries of the world, the small countries too, into what he called a League of Nations. This was going to be a super world government that would adjudicate differences among different countries. So instead of when Britain had a gripe against Germany or France had a claim against Italy, instead of resorting to war, they would put their differences to the League of Nations, and the League of Nations would act sort of as a court does. If you have a problem with your neighbor, you don't brain your neighbor, you don't beat him over the head, you sue your neighbor, and a court settles it out, and you work it out. And so this was Wilson's idea. He went to a peace conference after the war in Paris, at which he discovered that the Europeans, in particular America's allies, and we're not talking about America's enemies here, America's allies, they were willing to humor Wilson as long as they needed American assistance. It was clear that the British and the French, principally, had brought the United States in so their side would win, but they had no desire to embrace Wilson's ideas of democracy. These were empires. In fact, the British and the French, at the end of the war, expanded their empires. And Wilson came back from this, and he put the best face on it as he could. He brought a treaty home, the Treaty of Versailles, and it did have a provision for this League of Nations. But when it got back to the United States, Americans said, this is not what we expected. This is not the sort of thing we signed on for. The Treaty of Versailles was rejected by the U.S. Senate. And Americans very quickly came to conclude that that adventure, this venture into European politics, this moment when we ignored the advice of George Washington had been a really bad mistake. And this is 1919, when the Paris Peace Conference ends and the Treaty of Versailles is defeated. By the early 1920s, Americans, almost to a person, concluded that the American involvement in the war in Europe had been a mistake. The only question among Americans was whether it had been merely a mistake or a crime, because Americans began looking for those people who had argued the United States into the war. It wasn't just Wilson. There were some people who made a lot of money during the war. And these were manufacturers, especially of weapons and chemicals, the kind of thing that you use a lot of during war. And it was financiers. So the big banks in New York loaned money to the belligerents. And of course, if the belligerents lost the war, they wouldn't get paid back. And so Americans came to believe that this one moment, this one time when Americans had gone against the counsel of Washington and Jefferson, I could name any number of other presidents who said the same thing. We turned our back on that wise counsel, and look what it got us. 200,000 dead, billions of dollars gone, and they said, we're never going to do this again. And as the post-war decades in Europe played out, and as it became really clear that the war just ended, had not made the world safe for democracy or anything else, safe for anything else, it became clear that Europe was on track to go to war again. And Americans became even more convinced that it had been a mistake the first time around, and even more determined not to make the same mistake again. It wasn't just public opinion. It was public opinion for certain. But public opinion was translated into public law. Congress wrote laws, a series of laws called the Neutrality Act in the mid-1930s, that mandated that in the event another war broke out, they were focusing on Europe, but this applied more generally, but if another war broke out in Europe, as appeared very likely, that not only would the United States not get involved, but the President of the United States would have his hands tied, would not be able to allow the things that happened in World War I to draw the United States closer and closer in. They wouldn't happen the second time around. So, for example, the United States would not be able to sell weapons to belligerents. The weapons sales was one of the things that got American industrialists rooting for the Allied side in World War I. The United States would not be able to lend money to the belligerents. It was the money connection that had helped get the United States involved. American nationals would not be able to travel on belligerent ships. The sinking of the Lusitania killed over 100 Americans and got Americans all riled against Germany. So none of this was going to happen. So as of 1938, 1939, the laws were passed 1935, 36, 37. And by 37, it appeared more and more likely that Europe was going to go to war again. And Americans grew more and more determined to stay out. So the United States watched as Europe went to war in September 1939. And at that moment, again, the great majority of Americans believed we will not go to war. It would be stupid, it would be folly, it would be criminal for us to go to war, to make the mistake that we made before. We learned, and we're not going to do it again. So that's the story up to 1939. Stop, okay? Hold that thought. If I had asked the question on, I'll just say, August 31, 1939, the day before war breaks out, if I had asked the question, should the United States be the world's top cop? Should the United States be the leader of the free world? Nearly everybody in this room would have said, are you crazy? That's the dumbest idea I've ever heard of. Okay? Hold that. Because 2 years later, 2 years and 4 months later, Americans would change their mind. And American minds would remain changed for the next roughly 80 years. If I had asked this question, say in 1945, should the United States be the leader of the free world? Well, and especially if I'd put it that way, then well, of course, we have to be. If I'd put it in 1955, 65, 75, I'd get a little bit of skepticism because 75 is when, well, the war in Vietnam was turning out badly. And that's what being the world's top cop entails. Oh, I guess there was that moment at the end of the Korean War where 50,000 Americans had been killed and nothing had changed on the Korean Peninsula. So there were moments of doubt. But I asked the question in 2025. And I did phrase it in terms of the world's top cop, but I also gave you the option, leader of the free world. So to block things out, from 1789, when the government we have under our current Constitution began, until 1939, Americans said, no, we are not the leader of the world. We are not the world's top cop, with that one momentary exception. But then, after a brief period of arguing about it, Americans said, yes, we are. And Americans said, yep, we're going to do it, until, well, let's see, can we date? Can we date a time when this was seriously reconsidered, or became apparent that not being the leader of the free world, not being the world's top cop, was a viable political option? And I think we can. Donald Trump became president in 2017. Now, at that point, Donald Trump had adopted the label America First during his political campaign. And for those people who had long memories or who recalled what they learned in history class, America First harkened back to the time when there was this different view, that the United States should not automatically get involved in other people's wars. And for the first time since World War II, Donald Trump proposed that, these commitments that the United States has had around the world, well, maybe they're not so good for the United States. And he threatened to withdraw the United States from NATO, the military alliance of longest standing, if the European countries didn't pony up. And he even talked later about essentially handing deadbeat European countries over to Russia to do what Russia wanted to do with them. Now, Donald Trump was president for 4 years, and then he left office. And the subsequent president, Joseph Biden, essentially readopted or confirmed the old view that the United States must be the leader of the free world. If pressed on that, he might have said, yeah, I guess you could sort of call it top cop, but there's not really a whole lot of difference between those two except in the labeling. And if, for example, a war breaks out in the middle of what used to be the Soviet Union between Russia and Ukraine, it is necessary for the United States to take part in this war and help to see that Ukraine is not overrun by Russia. Now, if anybody had proposed this to George Washington, he would have said, this is ludicrous, this is beyond belief. If anybody had proposed it to Franklin Roosevelt in the mid-1930s, he would have said, not our affair. Donald Trump ran for election again. And the second time around, it was clearer to American voters what they could expect should Donald Trump be elected. The first time around, he was a little bit of a novelty act, and nobody quite knew what the Trump agenda would be. But the second time around, people knew what to expect. And so, for the first time since World War II, for the first time really since before World War II, American voters who went to the polls in 2024, they had a clear choice between, do you think the United States ought to be the world's top cop, the leader of the world? And if you thought that, and that was really the most salient issue for you, you voted for Kamala Harris. If you said no, maybe we shouldn't have it all, or maybe times have changed and we should not be in the future, then you had a choice to vote for Donald Trump. Okay, that's just the broad landscape. I wrote a book about the moment when things changed. And the moment when it's an extended moment. It lasts from September 1939 to December 1941. Now, December 1941, a critical moment. The debate over whether the United States should be the world's top cop or not, whether the United States should tend to its own affairs. That debate came to an end. And December 1941 will resonate with many of you so what do you think brought the debate to an end? Pearl Harbor. There's something about bombs falling from the sky that can bring talk to a conclusion. You got to make a decision now. So I wrote a book called America First. And it's not on the screen. Okay. Anyway, it's about this debate. It's about this landmark debate in American history between those who contended that the United States should get involved in the affairs of Europe, particularly in this war, and those who said the United States should not. America First was the label that was adopted by a committee, the America First Committee, which was the most visible of the anti-war committees. Now, here I have to say a word about labeling, because the America First Committee has very often been labeled, from then until now, as an isolationist group. The label was not conjured up by the America First Committee. It was applied to the America Firsters by their opponents, by the pro-war group, except they didn't call themselves pro-war. They called themselves pro-intervention. They called themselves, well, we're the ones who will take upon us responsibility for world leadership. The America Firsters said that America's security did not depend on what was going on in Europe, that America's security frontier should be about 200 miles off the coast of America, not on the Rhine River in Europe. Now, I decided to write this book about 4 or 5 years ago. And I proposed it to my publisher, say, we ought to publish this thing in the fall of 2024. Because there will be an election in 2024, and I have a hunch that this question of America's role in the world is going to be an element of the conversation, of the debate, in a way that it has not, really, since 1940. So this is okay, we'll do it. I wrote this book. And I hang the debate over America's role in the world on two characters. One character is Franklin Roosevelt. He's an obvious one to be one of my two protagonists. He was President of the United States. And what was Franklin Roosevelt in favor of? Franklin Roosevelt was a little bit hard to pin down. I know something about Franklin Roosevelt. I wrote a whole book on Franklin Roosevelt. And I can say with some confidence, not complete confidence, Roosevelt was slippery. And he did not bare his soul to anyone. He didn't keep a diary. He didn't live long enough to write a memoir, although I wouldn't have believed that if he had. But it's clear to me from his actions, from his previous positions and offices held, that Roosevelt concluded early on that the United States needed to succeed in doing what Woodrow Wilson had tried to do the first time around. Franklin Roosevelt was part of Woodrow Wilson's administration. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he thought that Wilson was right. He just hadn't managed to push it all the way to success. So Roosevelt was an internationalist. He wouldn't have owned up to the idea of being interventionist. But he believed that the United States needed to take this leading role in the world. He wouldn't have said top cop, but he would have said leader of the free world, except the free world term didn't exactly exist then. Leader of democracy, leader of the good guys. But he was also President of the United States, and he was the canniest politician ever to occupy the Oval Office. And so he was not telling the American people what he thought. He wanted to nudge the United States toward war. He wanted to get the United States closer and closer. He wanted to set up a situation where America would be dragged into war, almost against its own volition. But it wasn't against Roosevelt's volition. Now, I say this, and it might sound like I'm saying that Franklin Roosevelt was a devious character. Oh, he was a devious character. I might sound like he was doing something that was dishonest, misleading. Yeah, well, that was that too. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what he was doing was wrong. And this is something to consider. Because are there moments, I ask you, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but have you ever told a lie in the service of some good purpose? Have you ever done something, I don't know, in an official capacity that you wouldn't have done in a private capacity? This is something anybody who studies leadership, presidents, I've studied presidents, you have to grapple with. Can presidents, may presidents, should presidents lie? Should they deceive if it is in the national interest? I mean, maybe you agree, maybe you don't. Maybe you say, no, there's just one code of morality and that's it. Okay. But even if you agree to this to some degree, then the question then is, well, who determines? Who determines whether this is justified or not? This is why we have a constitution of checks and balances, but nonetheless, there's this part of the story. Anyway, now, this is something, I gave you the introduction. I set this thing up as a way of making clear that Roosevelt is the one who has to change the status quo of the American mind. Because he inherits an American people with 140 years of determination not to get involved in the affairs of Europe. So how does he persuade Americans to do it? Well, he says, well, we've got to change these neutrality laws. But every time he changes the neutrality laws, he said that this is for the purpose of keeping the United States out of war. For example, when war begins, Germany invades Poland in September 1939, and then Britain and France respond by declaring war on Germany. He says to Congress, we need to repeal that part of the neutrality legislation that says we can't sell weapons to the belligerents. And he says that, well, it's actually more likely to preserve American neutrality if we let Britain and France buy weapons, because they're behind the rebuilding of their army. Germany's ahead on this, and the Germans might win if we don't let the British and French level the playing field. And so, okay. And then later he would say, well, if they can't pay for the weapons, we'll give them the money. And then we'll just give them the weapons. And all the while, if we send them weapons, we won't have to send them troops. Now, by the end of this, by the end of the time he was saying this, Roosevelt not only knew that the United States was going to send troops, but he wanted the United States to send troops. More on that. So I described this debate. I've identified one of the protagonists. The other is a really unlikely character, an unlikely counter to Franklin Roosevelt, Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh. No one before 1939 connected Charles Lindbergh with politics. Charles Lindbergh, he had grown up in a political family. His father was a congressman from Minnesota, but his father had been badly treated by the US government during World War I for opposing American involvement in the war. He had been driven out of politics. He was writing a book, and the forerunner of the FBI came in and seized the printing plates and destroyed them. So he felt really badly used by this, just for exercising what he considered to be his First Amendment rights as an American citizen. Young Charles, his son, concluded that he didn't like politics at all. He was not a politician. He hated the idea of politics, but he found himself in the middle of a political debate. Charles Lindbergh was famous for flying across the Atlantic, nonstop, solo, in 1927. And from your study of history, how many of you know what else happened in 1927? There was a big deal in the world of sort of entertainment kind of things. Babe Ruth set the record for hitting home runs. So Babe Ruth hits 60 home runs, and Lindbergh flies across the Atlantic. And Lindbergh became America's hero because this Midwestern kid, tall, good-looking, unassuming, soft-spoken, didn't wear his celebrity on his sleeve or anything like that. And Americans thought, boy, this is the kind of guy that we are so happy to call an American. He was celebrated around the world. He liked to fly to various places, and everywhere he went, the governments gave him their highest honor, and they invited him to come look at their airplanes and do all this stuff and give them advice and all this stuff. So he was this world hero. And then he became a tragic figure in 1932 when his and his wife's infant son was kidnapped and murdered. And this became the crime of the century. The trial was the trial of the century. Lindbergh was the focus of all sorts of attention, much more attention than he wanted. This was, and this is a critical element of the story, this was a moment when the principal medium, the communications medium by which people got their news, was shifting from radio. Radio was still a big deal, but there was this new thing called the newsreel. And the newsreel was a short movie. The newsreel companies were actually the Hollywood film studios. And they had divisions that made these newsreels. And when you went to the movie theater on Saturday, you'd see between the films or before the films, you'd see 5 or 10 minutes of the latest news. And Lindbergh was catnip for this, and the story was catnip, because here's this handsome guy, pretty wife, and this horrible tragedy happens to them. And they didn't call him paparazzi in those days, but they followed him around, in fact, hounded him out of the country, and he took his family to England to live there. Anyway, when war breaks out, to the surprise of everybody, he becomes the principal spokesman for the anti-war position. And he says, we need to remember what George Washington said. We need to remember what Thomas Jefferson said. We need to remember the bad experience that we had the first time around. We said we're not going to make that mistake And we better maintain that view. We better not make that mistake. So the story that I tell focuses on this period between the outbreak of war in 1939, when this debate begins, because within days of the outbreak of war, Franklin Roosevelt goes to Congress and says we need to make those laws enforcing American neutrality, we need to bend them a little bit so we can help out Britain and France. And Lindbergh, he decides that I got to say something about this. He didn't have any political standing. He held no elective office, although because of his celebrity, the people, the Republicans, they were looking for a candidate to run against Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. And some of them said, Lindbergh, you could be the guy. You know, the United States had not elected a celebrity president at that point. But he was going to be one. And he did pay attention to national affairs. And he was well-versed. He had no, well, and this is actually an advantage, he had no track record to defend. There's no paper trail behind him. And so if you can get somebody like that, maybe you can elect him. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. But when the war began, and when Roosevelt begins by saying, I'm going to get the United States closer to war. No, he didn't. That's not the way Roosevelt put it, but Lindbergh said that's what the effect of this is going to be. And so Lindbergh decided to give a speech. Now, when the President of the United States gives a speech, the President of the United States, at least in those days, could command the airwaves. And so Roosevelt's speech was broadcast over the radio. Lindbergh, how did he get an audience? Well, Lindbergh was this great celebrity. And he called up the Mutual Broadcasting System, one of the radio networks, and he said, I'd like to give a speech. Would you air it? And they said, well, sure. He was a famous enough name that people would tune in and listen. And they could sell commercials the way they do, and so they were happy to do it. And he gave this speech, and it was, well, first of all, nobody had ever known that Charles Lindbergh could speak, could make an argument or anything like that, and he did a pretty good job. And so he was surprised at the positive response. Other people were too. And so this debate develops between Roosevelt and Lindbergh, and this is the story that I tell. And it's a debate that is marked by, well, the usual sort of politicking, some dissimulation, what they're arguing about is this first question: should the United States take up arms against Germany? Because by the time the debate really gets underway, France has been defeated by the Germans. So if the United States intervenes, it's going to be American soldiers fighting against Germans. So the narrow question was, is it in the American interest to fight Germany in the middle of Europe? Oh, except it's not always framed exactly that way, because a lot of Americans didn't, and I would say don't, like the idea that what the United States does is solely in the interest of the United States. Americans like to think, historically Americans have liked to think, that our actions are for the good of the world. And so maybe it should be good for the United States too, but it can't be simply good for the United States, because Americans don't like to think of themselves as greedy and self-serving. And so it was cast as, we will defeat Germany for the good of the United States, but also for the good of humanity. Because those Germans, those Nazis, Hitler, they're such bad people. And we're good people, and good people should act against bad people. Now, when I posed the question at the beginning of the session, I said, should the United States, well, top cop? Well, one of the things cops do is they protect weak, good people from powerful, bad people. And when the Biden administration says the United States ought to defend Ukraine, that's a very large part of it. Now, the argument is also made, of course, that this is in the American interest because if Russia gets too strong, then they're going to come after us, or something like that. This argument, I won't say it, it almost originates in the debate over whether the United States should go to war against Germany. Because at first, Germany seems to pose no threat to the United States. Europe's still far away, and Germany is fighting Britain. But the Roosevelt administration, in favor of going to war, believes, and this is one where I'm pretty sure Roosevelt was sincere when he said, if we don't fight Germany in Europe, we'll have to fight them in the Western Hemisphere. So better to fight them over there than on our own shores. But all of this stuff, of course, is a matter of, well, prediction. We're guessing about the future. The position of Lindbergh and the opponents of war was, we are quite ready to fight Germany, but we're not going to seek out a war with Germany. If Germany attacks us, if Germany comes across the Atlantic to attack us, in fact, if Germany sets foot or sets design upon anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, this was Lindbergh's position, the United States will fight them tooth and nail. But better fight them here on home soil, where we have short lines of communication and so on, than go all the way over there. This gets wrapped up in politics, because in the middle of this debate, Franklin Roosevelt announces that he is going to run for president a third time. This had never been done before. It wasn't technically, it wasn't unconstitutional. The Constitution did not yet forbid it, but it just hadn't been done because George Washington resigned after 2 terms. And for any subsequent president to say, I don't even want to get elected 3 times, is to say that he thought he was better than the father of his country. And you could get away with doing that. But Roosevelt did. Now, Roosevelt kept his potential opponents at bay. First, his opponents within the Democratic Party. Because he didn't say he wasn't going to run, but neither did he say he was going to run. So he basically froze potential opponents. Because until he said, I'm not running, then for a Democrat to say, I am running, it appeared to be disloyal. It would divide the Democratic vote. And so he put it off and put it off until it was too late for anybody else to mount a challenge to him. And then he managed to get the Democratic National Convention in 1940 to draft him, to say, we need you, President Roosevelt. And it was very cleverly engineered. At which point, Lindbergh said, this isn't simply about what's going on in Europe. It's about what's going on in the United States. Because President Roosevelt has used this war in Europe as an excuse to get himself elected president a 3rd term. And if he gets elected a 3rd time, he'll probably get elected a 4th time. He'll probably be president until he dies, which is, of course, what happened. Anyway, you know how the debate turned out. Lindbergh's side lost, but they didn't just lose. They were utterly discredited. And they were discredited by a couple of things. One, they were discredited by, well, I really hate to spoil the dramatic high point of my book. But I guess I will. People, maybe, should I not? I should. Okay. People went to watch that movie. What was it called? Titanic. They knew when they walked in the ship was going down. It was still a pretty good movie. So I have it on good authority that even if I give away the ending, it's still a pretty good book. So Charles Lindbergh found himself time and again outmaneuvered by Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt would say, this is not going to take us closer to war, but it did take America closer to war, and Americans liked it. And Lindbergh couldn't figure out why. Wait a minute, were you not paying attention during World War I, during the 1920s, during the 1930s? What's going on here? One of the things that was going on was that Franklin Roosevelt appealed to this emerging sense of American greatness. What Roosevelt was saying is, no, he didn't say we're going to be the world's top cop. He said we're going to be the leader of the world. And for a lot of Americans, I suspect even today, I know, even today, that's a very heady idea. We're the leader of the world. The world needs us. We're the good guys against the bad guys. And who doesn't want to be in that position? There was that. Roosevelt was much better at maneuvering political votes. Roosevelt, unbeknownst to Lindbergh, unbeknownst to anybody in the United States, was carrying on a secret correspondence with Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, and was making deals with Churchill as President of the United States, Prime Minister of Britain, without informing anybody in Congress, without informing anybody in the United States, essentially tying the United States, the future of the United States, to that of Britain. But, Winston, you got to keep this quiet until we can finally sort of announce it in public. So there was all of this. Lindbergh was getting more and more frustrated. until a moment in the autumn of 1941. Oh, I should say, Roosevelt, did get elected the third time, and then the immediate next thing he did was to ask Congress for what became the Lend-Lease program. We're simply going to go all in on the side of the Allies. This idea of neutrality, remember that quaint notion from the mid-1930s? That's out the window. The only question was how soon America is going to get involved. So Lindbergh gives what amounts to his last radio address. It's in September 1941. And he's very frustrated. And he says that there are three groups that are most consequential in drawing the United States toward war. One group is the British government. He said it's perfectly understandable that the Brits want to see us in the war. They're having a really hard time, and if we come in on their side, it'll help them a lot. He said, I do not begrudge them that desire, but I don't think the British should dictate American policy. American policy should be made independently. The second group, said Lindbergh, is Jewish Americans. And he said, it's perfectly understandable that people who have relatives, friends, who have been persecuted the way Jews in Europe have been, would feel a desire for the United States to come to the aid of those who are fighting against Hitler. That I don't begrudge this at all, it's their perfect right, but I don't think this small minority in the United States should dictate policy to the rest of the United States. The third group, and the one for which that Lindbergh reserved his most bitter complaint, was the Roosevelt administration. Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, is doing this for his own political purposes. He is putting his own private interests ahead of the interests of the United States. This is what Lindbergh said. And the next day, the only thing the papers focused on was Charles Lindbergh's anti-Semitism. How dare he raise the issue of religion, and that was the way it was put. The issue of religion at such a moment as this. And Lindbergh had already lost the debate. It was concluded just a couple months later when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And that really ended all debate. The United States is at war, and the first thing that Lindbergh did after the United States declared war is he volunteered for war. But Roosevelt said, forget it. The last thing Roosevelt wanted was for his principal critic to go off and become a military hero. But the result of this was that people remembered that the America First people, the ones who opposed the war, they were led by this guy who said this horribly anti-Semitic thing. Not only that, that idea became reinforced as the war progressed to its end. When American armies invading Germany, Russian armies invading Poland, came across the death camps and realized the full horrendousness of the Nazi regime. So by that point, I should add, by this time also, 400,000 Americans had died in fighting against the Nazi regime. And so nobody was willing to even entertain the idea that, those people who had opposed entry to the war, they might have been right. No. It was really clear the United States had been on the good guys' side, and moreover, that the people on the other side were not simply ignorant, but they were probably bad people like that anti-Semite, Charles Lindbergh. Anyway, so I've run out of time. I was going to allow you questions, but you've been very good. Oh, one question.
What happens in the next World War? Do we end the world?
I certainly hope I don't have to answer that question. Yes?
Can you just comment briefly on Joe Kennedy's involvement?
So Joseph Kennedy, the father of the other Kennedys, John Kennedy, Bobby and Ted Kennedy, he was American ambassador to Britain during the late 1930s. He was sent there because Franklin Roosevelt worried that Joe Kennedy might try to get the Democratic nomination for president, so get him out of the country. And Kennedy was skeptical that Britain could defeat Germany if it came to a war, because the British were not prepared. And one of the things that Kennedy said, and one of the things that Lindbergh said is, the British, they suckered us in the first time around. They couldn't win the war. They're not preparing for war this second time, and they weren't prepared when the war began, because they expect we're going to come rescue them. And Kennedy said, don't expect this. You can't count on this. So He was, for this, of course, he was labeled an isolationist, as all these people were. I should just add, they weren't isolationists. They were opposed to this war. They were opposed to the idea that America should be the world's cop. I've run out of time. Thank you very much.